He offered his bed to two exhausted Apache, but their father arrived with 150 warriors. John had lived on the edge of the wilderness for many years. His small cabin, built with his own hands, stood alone among the towering pine trees, far from the nearest settlement. Life here was quiet, sometimes painfully so, but John had grown used to it. He enjoyed the silence, the sound of the wind through the trees, and the slow rhythm of his own life.
Hunting and gathering provided him with everything he needed, and he had long since learned to rely only on himself.
Yet, despite his independence, he never felt completely alone in the world. There was a part of him that longed for connection, even in this lonely place. That evening, the sky was painted with shades of red and orange, signaling the end of another day. John had returned from hunting just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. His body ached from walking through rough terrain and dragging his catch, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had survived another day in the wilderness, and his cabin would shelter him through the coming night. As he approached, he noticed something unusual, a movement near the tree line, just beyond the small clearing in front of his cabin. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but as he stepped closer, he realized the shapes were human. Two figures were slowly approaching his cabin. They moved cautiously, as if afraid of being noticed, and John could see that they were young men, perhaps in their late teens or early 20s. Their clothes were worn and dirty, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. They carried nothing but small bundles, and their eyes darted nervously from side to side. There was something about them that immediately caught John's attention. The weariness in their movements, the fear that lingered in their expressions, and the careful way they avoided any sudden gestures. It was clear they had been traveling for a long time, and that they were both tired and wary.
John's first instinct was to reach for his rifle.
After all, encounters with strangers, especially in these lands, were often dangerous. But something in their eyes made him pause. There was no malice there, only exhaustion and uncertainty. John had faced hostile encounters before, but he had also learned that sometimes appearances could be deceiving. He took a deep breath and decided to take a chance. Slowly, he stepped forward, raising his hand slightly to show that he meant no harm. "Hey there," he called out in a calm voice, careful not to sound threatening. "You need help?" The two young men froze for a moment, their eyes widening in surprise. One of them spoke, his words broken and halting. We need shelter." John nodded slowly. He understood enough to know that they were asking for protection, at least for the night. Without hesitation, he opened the door to his cabin. "Come inside," he said. "You can rest here tonight. You'll be safe."
The young men exchanged a quick glance, a silent conversation passing between them.
Then, as if making a decision together, they stepped forward cautiously, entering the cabin. The warmth from the fire greeted them, and John noticed the way their bodies relaxed slightly as they sank to the floor, finally letting go of some of the tension that had held them upright for so long. John moved around the cabin, putting his bundle of firewood away and checking that everything was secure. He could feel the eyes of the young men on him, curious and cautious. He didn't speak immediately, giving them time to adjust to their new surroundings. After a few minutes, he offered them food, a simple meal of bread, dried meat, and a little fresh water he had stored from the nearby stream. They ate slowly, grateful for every bite, their hands shaking slightly from fatigue and hunger. As the evening wore on, John noticed that the young men were too tired to sit upright. Their heads drooped, and their eyes grew heavy. He realized that they would need to sleep, but his cabin had only one bed. Without hesitation, he gestured toward it. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep on the floor." The offer seemed to surprise them. Breaths. They hesitated, unsure if this stranger's kindness was genuine. But the exhaustion in their bodies won over their doubts, and they slowly moved toward the bed. John watched them carefully, making sure they were comfortable. He could see the relief in their eyes, the way their shoulders relaxed, and the tension in their faces soften. Once they had settled in, John went to the floor near the fire, spreading out a small blanket. He sat quietly listening to the sounds of the wilderness outside. Vibration. The wind rustled the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl echoed in the distance, and the fire crackled softly. Yet despite the peace, John could feel a sense of unease building in the back of his mind. He knew that offering shelter to strangers could be dangerous, and he couldn't ignore the possibility that trouble might come knocking at his door.
He glanced at the young men again.
One of them had already fallen asleep, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The other was still awake, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, a mixture of caution and curiosity in his gaze. John smiled faintly, feeling a strange connection to these two young men. He didn't know their story yet, but he could sense their pain and fear. And in that moment he understood that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could mean the difference between life and death. As the night grew darker, John allowed his thoughts to wander. He thought about his life in the wilderness, about the solitude he had grown accustomed to, and about the rare moments when he had felt a deep connection with another human being. He realized that in all his years living alone, he had rarely encountered someone who depended entirely on his goodwill. The responsibility felt heavy, but it was also strangely rewarding. Hours passed quietly. The fire dwindled to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with the soft rhythm of breathing. Outside, the wilderness stretched endlessly, filled with hidden dangers and unknown creatures. But inside, for this brief moment, there was safety. John stayed awake, his eyes scanning the shadows, ready to protect his unexpected guests if necessary. He didn't know what the future would bring, or whether this small act of kindness would be repaid with gratitude or met with hostility. All he knew was that he had made a choice, to help when he could, even at the risk of his own safety. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with John as well. He lay down on the floor near the fire, keeping one eye open but allowing his body to rest. The young men slept peacefully, unaware of the thoughts running through his mind. In the quiet of the wilderness, a fragile trust had been established. Trust between strangers. Trust born out of compassion and necessity. It was a trust that could be broken in an instant, but for now, it held firm, wrapping the cabin in a sense of fragile security and silent understanding. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant sound of running water. The night stretched on, calm yet unpredictable, a reminder that life on the frontier was never entirely safe. But within the small cabin, amidst the shadows and the flickering firelight, a simple truth shone through. Kindness, even in the most unexpected moments, could provide warmth and safety in a world that often seemed cold and unforgiving. Grasp. And so John kept watch, silent and vigilant as the night deepened and the wilderness around him held its breath. He had offered shelter to two strangers, and in doing so he had opened the door to a story that was only just beginning. A story of courage, trust, and the unpredictable bonds that could form between people in the most unlikely of circumstances. The morning sun rose slowly over the mountains, casting a golden light across the small clearing where John's cabin stood. Birds began to chirp, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze created a peaceful sound that seemed almost magical after the tense night. John stirred from the floor where he had slept, stretching his aching muscles and rubbing his eyes. He had only slept for a few hours, but he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The young men were still asleep in the bed, their breathing steady, and for the moment the world outside the cabin felt calm and quiet. John quietly moved to the small wooden table near the window and prepared a simple breakfast. But he had some bread, a little dried meat, and a few berries he had gathered the day before. He also poured water from his jug into a small tin cup and set it near the fire to warm slightly. As he worked, he stole glances at the two young men, noticing the way the sunlight caught their tired faces. Their eyes were still closed, their expressions soft in sleep. They looked like boys more than men in this light, fragile and worn from the hardships they had endured. John felt a wave of sympathy for them, and he silently hoped that this day would bring them some comfort. Eventually, the older of the two stirred. His eyes fluttered, and he sat up slowly, stretching his arms as if to shake off the weight of exhaustion. John offered a small smile. "Morning," he said softly. "I've made some breakfast." The young man looked around, taking in the cabin and John himself. Britt. His eyes were cautious, still unsure of this stranger's intentions, but the warmth in John's voice seemed to put him at ease. He nodded slowly, accepting the offer, and motioned for his brother to join him. The younger boy, still rubbing the sleep from his eyes, crawled out of the bed and hesitated near the table. John gestured for him to sit, and the boy obeyed, moving closer to the food but still keeping a careful distance from John. As they ate, the two young men began to speak quietly in their own language, their voices low and hesitant. John could not understand their words, but he could see the relief on their faces as they shared what must have been their first peaceful meal in many days. He watched them carefully, sensing a story behind their weariness, a story of struggle, of survival, of a life far different from his own quiet existence in the wilderness. Once they had eaten, John brought out some blankets and sat near the fire, ready to listen if they wished to speak. Slowly the older one looked at him, then gestured with his hands, trying to communicate. John nodded, encouraging him silently.
It took several moments filled with broken words and careful gestures, but gradually, the older brother began to explain their situation.
They had been traveling through the forests after being separated from their tribe. There had been a raid, and in the chaos, they had become lost. They had wandered for days, avoiding danger, searching for safety, and hoping to find someone who would help them. John listened intently, offering small nods and words of understanding. He could see the pain in their eyes, the fear they carried, and he realized how fragile life could be in the wilderness. These young men had survived hunger, exhaustion, and the constant threat of danger, yet they still had hope in their hearts. John felt a deep admiration for their resilience. The younger brother finally spoke, though only in short phrases. He pointed to his chest, then to his mouth, indicating hunger. He pointed to his eyes and then to the forest, showing that they had been watching, walking, and surviving without rest. John nodded, understanding fully, and handed him some fresh water. The boy drank eagerly, his small hands shaking slightly from fatigue. John realized that even the simplest things, food, warmth, water, could bring comfort and hope to those who had faced hardship. After breakfast, John suggested that they wash up at the small stream nearby. The boys hesitated at first, unsure if they could trust him, but John's calm demeanor reassured them. They followed him quietly, and the cool water refreshed their tired bodies. As they washed, John noticed the scars and bruises on their arms and legs, silent reminders of the dangers they had faced.
He said nothing, respecting their privacy, but the sight made his heart ache.
These young men had faced more than most could imagine, and yet they were still alive, still standing, still searching for safety. Back at the cabin, the young men began to relax, slowly letting go of some of the tension that had gripped them. They explored the small space, touching the wooden walls, inspecting the tools and belongings John had gathered over the years. Their curiosity was innocent, yet cautious, as if they were learning to trust this man who had offered them shelter without question. John watched with a mixture of amusement and admiration. Trust, he knew, was a fragile thing, especially in a world where danger was always near. As the day went on, the young men began to share more of their story, using gestures and broken words. They had been part of a small group traveling with their tribe when a rival group attacked. In the chaos, they were separated from their family and forced to flee. They had walked for days, hiding in forests and valleys, avoiding settlers and wild animals alike. Their voices, though quiet, carried the weight of their experiences, the fear, the loss, and the longing to be reunited with their family.
John felt a deep empathy for them.
He had faced loneliness and hardship himself, but he had never known the fear of being hunted or separated from loved ones. Yet, in some ways, he understood the feeling of vulnerability, the longing for safety, and the relief that came from finding someone who could offer protection. Bound and desperate, he realized that despite the differences in their lives, they shared a common humanity, a need for care, trust, and understanding.
By afternoon, the young men were beginning to regain some of their strength.
John showed them how to prepare simple food, how to gather water safely, and even shared a few hunting tips. They watched him closely, absorbing every word, every gesture,
Learning the ways of survival in the wilderness.
In return, they taught him small things from their own experiences. How to recognize certain tracks in the forest, how to find edible plants, and how to move quietly through the woods. This exchange created a bond, a silent understanding that they were no longer strangers, but companions in a shared moment of trust and learning. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the cabin, John felt a sense of accomplishment. The young men had eaten, rested, and begun to regain their energy. The tension that had filled the cabin the night before had eased, replaced by a cautious calm. John could see the gratitude in their eyes, the silent thanks that did not require words.
It was a feeling he had rarely experienced, knowing that his small acts of kindness had made a real difference in the lives of others.
That evening, as they sat near the fire, John encouraged them to share more about their lives, to tell stories of their tribe, their family, and their homeland. They spoke in gestures, in broken words, and in the quiet language of understanding that requires no translation. John listened intently, realizing that these stories, though simple, were filled with lessons of courage, resilience, and hope. He felt honored that they trusted him enough to share their lives, even in this short time. Night fell again, and the cabin grew quiet. The young men prepared for sleep, this time with a little more confidence, knowing that John was nearby. He watched them settle in, their bodies still tired, but their spirits lifted slightly. For the first time in many days, they felt safe. John sat by the fire, his thoughts wandering. He knew that the world outside was unpredictable and dangerous. But for now, within the walls of the cabin there was peace, breath, and in that peace, a fragile trust had been formed, a trust that might be tested in the days to come, but which would endure as long as kindness guided their actions. The night deepened, and the fire's glow softened against the darkness outside. Breaths. John kept watch again, but this time he felt less fear and more a quiet sense of responsibility. These young men had trusted him with their lives, and he had accepted that trust willingly. In the wilderness, trust was rare and precious, and John knew that he had been given a gift by simply being allowed into their lives. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint sounds of wildlife and the distant mountains' breaths. Inside, the cabin was warm, filled with the quiet breathing of two young men who were no longer simply strangers, but guests, friends, and perhaps something more. John leaned back against the wall, letting the events of the day settle in his mind. He realized that the small acts of care, of listening, and of offering shelter had transformed what could have been a dangerous encounter into a moment of connection, understanding, and humanity. And so, as the night stretched on, John allowed himself to rest, confident that he had done the right thing. Outside, the wilderness remained wild and untamed, full of unseen threats and challenges. But inside, in that small cabin, two young men slept peacefully, and John watched over them, ready to face whatever the next day might bring. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth from the surrounding forest. Sunlight filtered through the tall trees, creating patches of light and shadow that danced across the cabin and the small clearing around it. John woke early again, feeling the ache in his muscles from another night on the floor. Despite the discomfort, he felt a sense of satisfaction. The two young men were still asleep, their bodies stretched out on the bed, finally at ease. For the first time in days, they seemed safe, and that knowledge gave John a quiet comfort. He moved quietly around the cabin, careful not to wake them. The previous day had been full of small victories, food shared, trust gained, stories exchanged, but John knew that peace in the wilderness was fragile. One wrong step, one misjudgment could change everything. As he stoked the fire to life again, he listened to the soft sounds outside. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, and the occasional snap of a twig. He was alert, aware that danger could approach without warning. Yet he also allowed himself a small measure of hope. For now, at least, there was calm. When the young men began to stir, John offered a simple greeting. "Morning," he said gently, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "You slept well?" The older brother rubbed his eyes and gave a small nod, though his face still carried the shadow of exhaustion. The younger boy moved more slowly, glancing around the cabin as if testing whether the world outside was safe yet. Braces. John handed them both water and encouraged them to eat the simple breakfast he had prepared: bread, dried meat, and a few berries. They ate in silence at first, savoring the nourishment and the warmth from the fire. Their hunger had been strong, and now, sitting comfortably, they seemed almost childlike in their quiet gratitude. After breakfast, John stepped outside to check the surroundings. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a mix of light and shadow that hid both beauty and danger. He examined the edges of the clearing, noting where one could easily approach, unseen. The sense of unease he felt was subtle but persistent. He had grown familiar with the wilderness over the years. An instinct told him that something was approaching, not necessarily a threat yet, but a presence that demanded caution. He returned to the cabin, his mind alert. The young men began to stir from their rest, and John suggested a small task to help pass the time. "You can gather some firewood," he said, pointing to a stack near the trees. "It will help us later." They hesitated, unsure whether they should trust the offer, but eventually they nodded and stepped outside. Watching them move among the trees, John felt a mix of admiration and concern. Their movements were careful, almost instinctive, and he could tell they had survived in the wilderness before. Still, he kept a watchful eye on the surrounding forest, scanning for any sign of danger. While the boys worked, John reflected on the bond that had begun to form. It was fragile, delicate, but real. In the span of a single day, trust had been built, not through words alone, but through actions, sharing food, offering warmth, showing care. Yet he knew that trust was tested most when the world around you was unpredictable. The wilderness had a way of revealing the true nature of people, and John understood that the coming hours might challenge the fragile peace they had created. The older brother paused in his task, looking back at the cabin as if sensing something in the air. John noticed the glance and walked toward him. "What is it?" he asked softly. The young man hesitated, pointing toward the horizon, then making a small gesture with his hands as though describing a distant movement. John squinted into the distance. At first he saw nothing unusual, only the forest stretching endlessly with shadows and sunlight. But then he noticed a faint disturbance, a dust cloud rising far away, barely visible against the backdrop of the hills. His heart skipped a beat. While it could have been nothing, John knew better. Movement in these lands often carried meaning, and this could be the sign of approaching travelers. He didn't want to alarm the young men, so he kept his tone calm. "We'll keep watch," he said. "Stay near the cabin and don't wander too far." They nodded, sensing the seriousness in his voice. and returned to their work with careful, deliberate movements. John, meanwhile, began to prepare for any eventuality. He gathered a few tools and small items that could serve as defense, though he hoped they would never be needed. The forest, for all its beauty, was unpredictable. And in moments like this, preparation was as much about reassurance as safety. Hours passed slowly. The sunlight shifted, casting longer shadows across the clearing. John and the young men moved in a rhythm born of necessity, gathering firewood, tending the small garden he maintained, and preparing a modest meal basis. Yet beneath the ordinary tasks, a current of tension ran through the air. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant bird call carried a hint of possible danger. Breath. John noticed the subtle changes in the boys' expressions, the way they paused to listen, the way their eyes scanned the forest. They were young yet alert, aware that the world outside their temporary safety could change at any moment. As the afternoon wore on, John decided to take a walk along the edge of the clearing. He wanted to familiarize himself with the terrain, to know exactly where someone could approach unseen. The boys followed at a respectful distance, silent but attentive. They moved carefully, their eyes scanning the forest, as if reading it like a map. John observed them closely, impressed by their instincts. Though exhausted, they were survivors, and their alertness was proof of the hardships they had endured. Returning to the cabin, John noticed that their trust in him was growing, even if slowly. The older brother spoke more freely now, using broken words and gestures to explain parts of their journey. They had been separated from their tribe not long ago, and for days they had relied only on each other, moving silently through forests and across streams, always aware of the dangers around them. John listened with respect and patience, realizing that even the smallest details they shared were significant, each one a testament to their resilience and courage. Despite the growing calm, John felt an underlying tension he could not ignore. The dust cloud he had seen in the distance earlier still lingered in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was approaching. He decided to prepare a plan, simple but practical. If trouble came, he would need to protect not only himself but these young men who had come to rely on him. He moved around the cabin, ensuring that exits were clear and that supplies were within reach. Every action was deliberate, every movement purposeful. The young men, sensing his caution, began to ask questions in their limited English, their curiosity tempered by respect. They wanted to know more about John's life in the wilderness, about how he survived, and about the strange yet comforting cabin that had become a haven for them. John shared small stories, simple lessons learned from years of living alone, how to find fresh water, how to recognize animal tracks, and how to move quietly through the forest. The boys listened intently, absorbing the knowledge as if it were vital to their survival. As evening approached, the light began to fade, and shadows grew longer across the clearing. John noticed the boys becoming quieter, their earlier energy giving way to fatigue once again. He offered them food and water, reminding them to rest, and they obeyed, settling near the fire while he kept watch. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and every sound wind through the trees, a distant bird, the crackle of the fire, carried weight and meaning. John felt a mixture of anticipation and unease, knowing that the calm might not last. Night fell slowly, and the sky turned deep blue, dotted with stars. The forest around the cabin seemed both beautiful and intimidating, a reminder of the wilderness's endless mysteries. John sat by the fire watching the boys as they drifted into sleep, reflected on the day, on the trust they had begun to share, and on the invisible thread that connected them. Yet even in this quiet moment he could sense that something was coming, something that would test the fragile peace they had built. He stayed awake, alert to every sound, aware that the approaching presence he had noticed earlier might reveal itself at any moment. The boys slept peacefully, unaware of the tension in the air, and John silently promised himself that he would protect them, whatever it took.
The night was long, filled with uncertainty. Yet within the small cabin there was a sense of fragile hope.
They had survived another day together, and for now, that was enough. As the hours passed, the forest whispered its secrets, and John remained vigilant. The young men had begun to understand the value of trust, and John had learned the importance of compassion and courage in unexpected situations. In the stillness of the wilderness, a delicate balance had been achieved, a balance that might soon be disrupted, but which had for now allowed a measure of safety and connection. The forest was quiet that morning, yet a strange tension hung in the air. John had woken early, as always, moving silently around the cabin to check the surroundings. He had sensed that something significant was approaching, and his instincts proved correct. In the distance, beyond the rolling hills and thick trees, he noticed movement. A large, shifting cloud of dust rising from the path that wound through the forest. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the size of what was coming. It was no lone traveler, no small group. It was a large band of people, moving with purpose. John's mind raced. He estimated that at least 100 individuals were advancing toward the clearing.
His chest tightened, not out of fear, but from the realization of the responsibility he now bore.
The two young men, his unexpected guests, were asleep in the cabin. He did not know exactly who was approaching, but he had a strong suspicion. The older brother had spoken of his father and his tribe before, but John had not expected them to find this remote spot so quickly. Now he knew they were coming. Waj. He gently nudged the older brother awake.
Wake up, he whispered.
Look outside! The young man sat up immediately, his eyes widening at the sight of the distant dust cloud. He turned to his brother, who had also awakened, and together they stared, their expressions a mixture of fear, awe, and recognition. They had known this day would come, but seeing it with their own eyes was overwhelming. John could feel their anxiety, the unspoken question in their minds. Would this visit bring safety or danger? Stepping outside slowly to get a better view, the clearing stretched wide before him, and the dust cloud now revealed itself more clearly. He could see hundreds of figures, moving steadily but deliberately, their forms silhouetted by the sun. The young men's father led the group, mounted on a sturdy horse, his posture commanding and strong. Around him, warriors moved in organized lines, their eyes sharp, their movements controlled. John knew he was in a delicate position. One wrong move could lead to a deadly misunderstanding. He turned back to the boys. "Stay here," he said firmly, though not harshly. "Do not come outside yet. Trust me." They nodded quickly, though their eyes betrayed concern. John returned to the edge of the clearing, hands raised slightly to show that he meant no harm. His voice was steady, even though his heart pounded in his chest. The father's eyes scanned the cabin, then John, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The warriors slowed their advance, sensing the tension in the air. John stepped forward a few more paces, keeping his hands visible. "I mean no harm," he called out in English, though he knew they might not understand his words. He hoped that the calm in his voice and his deliberate gestures would communicate what words could not. The young men emerged slowly from the cabin, staying close to John's side. Their faces were pale but determined. They gestured to their father, trying to explain that John had helped them, had given them food, shelter, and protection. The father's eyes softened slightly at the sight of his sons, but he remained alert, scanning the clearing and the cabin for any signs of deceit or danger. The warriors around him were tense, hands resting near their weapons, ready to respond to any perceived threat.
John continued to speak calmly, repeating his gestures of peace.
He pointed to the boys, then to himself, then spread his arms wide, signaling that he had offered nothing but care and kindness. The father watched closely, weighing every movement, every expression. Time seemed to stretch as both sides assessed the situation, trying to understand intentions without words. The air was thick with tension, each heartbeat echoing like a drum in the silence of the clearing. Finally, the father dismounted from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a solid, deliberate thud. He approached slowly, his eyes fixed on John. The young men followed, remaining close to their father but glancing at John with cautious gratitude. The warriors behind him remained in formation, a silent wall of strength and readiness. John kept his hands raised, his posture calm but firm. He knew that this was a critical moment. One mistake, one wrong glance or gesture could ignite conflict. The father stopped a few paces from John, studying him carefully. John could feel the weight of those eyes, assessing his character, his intentions, and, perhaps, even his courage. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the father raised a hand, not in aggression, but in a gesture of attention. He spoke in a language John did not understand, but the tone was measured, not hostile. The young men translated as best they could, explaining that their father was questioning John, trying to understand why he had helped them, why he had offered shelter and safety. John nodded, using gestures and simple words to explain. He pointed to the boys, then to himself, then placed a hand over his heart, showing that his actions came from honesty and compassion. The father's expression remained serious, but he seemed to be weighing the truth of John's gestures against the danger that surrounded them. Slowly, the tension in the air began to shift, from uncertainty to cautious understanding. The warriors remained alert, but they relaxed their stance slightly, sensing that immediate violence was unlikely. The father spoke again, this time with a tone that John could sense carried respect. He acknowledged John's courage and the kindness he had shown to his sons. It was not spoken in words John fully understood, but the meaning was clear. The two young men exhaled softly, relief spreading across their faces as they realized that their father was not angered, that they were safe. John lowered his hands slightly, allowing a small smile to appear. He gestured toward the cabin, then to the boys, showing that they were welcome to stay for now, and that he had no ill intent. The father nodded, approving the unspoken understanding. A sense of relief washed over the clearing. The moment of tension had passed, replaced by a fragile peace. John could see the gratitude in the eyes of the young men, and he felt a quiet pride in having navigated the encounter successfully. The father then spoke to his warriors, who slowly began to spread out, moving around the clearing but maintaining a respectful distance. John observed carefully, making no sudden movements.
The warriors' presence was intimidating in sheer number, but there was no aggression, only vigilance.
The father's careful leadership ensured that the situation remained controlled. John realized how important trust and communication were in these moments, and he silently admired the discipline and courage of the warriors around him. For the next hour, the father and John remained near the center of the clearing, observing each other, communicating through gestures and limited words, building a mutual understanding. John offered water and simple gestures of hospitality to the father and his warriors, further easing the tension. Gradually, the initial fear that had gripped the clearing began to fade. The boys moved freely among their father and the warriors, laughing quietly, sharing gestures and signs that reflected relief and happiness. By late afternoon, the group had settled into a comfortable routine. The father had accepted John's presence, and while the warriors remained alert, they were no longer tense. The boys shared small stories of their journey, pointing to the forest and mimicking events that had occurred. John listened, fascinated and moved by their resilience. The father occasionally spoke, his words firm but approving, and John could sense the mutual respect that had formed. Trust, once fragile, was now growing stronger, and it was clear that all parties understood that cooperation rather than conflict was the better path. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, John felt a sense of calm and accomplishment. The initial fear of overwhelming numbers had passed, replaced by a fragile alliance built on honesty, courage, and respect. The boy's father had recognized John's good intentions, and the warriors, while still vigilant, were no longer threatening. For the first time, John could see that acts of kindness, even in a world filled with danger, could bridge differences and create understanding. That evening, as the group gathered near the fire, John sat with the boys and their father, sharing a simple meal. The words were few, the atmosphere was warm. Smiles appeared, gestures of appreciation were exchanged, and the boys leaned close to John, a quiet acknowledgement of his courage and care. Outside the clearing, the forest remained wild and untamed, but within it, peace had been established. For now the danger had passed, and a bond of trust and respect had been formed, one that would endure far longer than the fleeting moment of fear that had preceded it. And as night fell, with stars shining above and the forest whispering its ancient songs, John realized that bravery and kindness had the power to prevent conflict, to heal fear, and to create understanding between even the most unlikely of companions. He had faced overwhelming odds, and through patience, courage, and empathy, he had ensured the safety of 2 young lives and earned the respect of an entire tribe. The moment would stay with him forever, a reminder of the fragile yet powerful nature of trust in a world filled with uncertainty. The first light of dawn crept over the forest, bathing the clearing in a soft golden glow. John woke early, as he had done for years, but today there was no tightness in his chest, no lingering tension. The night had passed without incident, and for the first time since the 2 young men had appeared at his cabin, he felt a sense of calm that went beyond simple relief. He stretched his arms, letting the morning air fill his lungs, and glanced around the clearing. The boys were awake, talking quietly with their father, who was seated near the fire with his warriors standing respectfully behind him. It was a remarkable sight. Despite the differences in culture, language, and history, there was a quiet harmony in the clearing. John observed the interactions, noticing the subtle ways respect and understanding had been established. The father's posture was firm but relaxed, the warriors alert but not threatening, and the boys at ease for the first time in days. It was a testament to what human kindness, patience, and courage could achieve, even in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. John prepared a simple breakfast, just as he had done the day before, and offered it to the family and warriors. The father nodded politely, accepting the gesture, while the boys smiled with gratitude. As they ate, John and the father began a slow, careful conversation. Words were limited, but through gestures, expressions, and broken speech, they shared a mutual understanding. John explained that he had offered shelter because he believed that no one should suffer when he could help. The father in turn acknowledged the courage it had taken to care for his sons in the wilderness, a place full of danger and uncertainty. After breakfast, the father motioned for the boys to speak. They began to recount their journey, filling in the details of the days they had spent separated from the tribe. They described the fear, the hunger, and the uncertainty, but also the hope that had carried them forward. But John listened quietly, deeply moved by their courage. The boys' words, though simple, carried weight. They spoke of their father's leadership, of their tribe, and of the lessons they had learned during their time in the forest. Through their stories, John gained a sense of the rich culture and values that had guided them, and he felt honored to have played even a small role in their survival. As the morning passed, the father and John moved slightly apart from the group, speaking with gestures and expressions that conveyed mutual respect and understanding. The father explained that he had been searching for his sons tirelessly, and that he had feared for their safety. John described the night he had spent guarding them, ensuring that no harm would come to them. The father's eyes softened, recognizing the courage and integrity that John had demonstrated. In that moment, a silent bond formed between them, a bond not of words, but of shared humanity. The warriors, observing from a distance, began to relax. They had been tense at first, ready for any threat, But seeing the peaceful resolution and the care shown by John, they understood that their presence was no longer needed for protection alone. The boys moved among the warriors, laughing quietly, pointing out familiar signs in the forest, and sharing stories of their journey. It was a rare and beautiful moment of connection, where differences were bridged by trust, and fear gave way to understanding. John realized that this experience had changed him. He had always lived alone, relying only on himself. Yet in these past few days, he had discovered the profound impact of kindness and trust. Offering shelter to the boys had been a risk, but it had also been an opportunity, a chance to show compassion and to witness the power of humanity in action. The father, too, seemed to recognize the importance of this moment. He spoke softly to John, a simple phrase accompanied by a gesture of respect. Though the words were limited, the meaning was clear. He acknowledged John's courage, his empathy, and his unwavering commitment to protecting the boys. As the sun climbed higher, John helped prepare the boys for the journey back to their tribe. He offered guidance on the safest paths, pointing out landmarks and providing small supplies for the journey. The father and warriors moved around them, ensuring that everything was in order. There was a sense of purpose and determination in the air, but also a quiet warmth, as if the hardships of the past days had created a new understanding between all involved. The boys hugged John briefly, their small hands gripping his tightly, a gesture of deep gratitude that words could not fully express. Before leaving, the father spoke again, this time addressing John directly. He extended his hand, not in a simple handshake, but in a gesture filled with respect and trust. John took it, feeling the strength and sincerity in the grip. It was a moment that transcended language and culture, a moment that symbolized the successful bridging of two worlds through empathy and courage. The warriors formed a line, bowing slightly in acknowledgement, and the boys' faces shone with relief and happiness. As they began to move back into the forest, John watched carefully. The dust from their movement rose into the morning air, a visual reminder of the journey they had endured and the bond they had formed. He felt a mixture of pride and quiet melancholy. Pride in having helped these young lives, and melancholy because he knew that their paths would soon diverge. Yet he also felt hope. Hope that this small act of kindness would remain in their hearts, guiding them in the future, just as the memory of their trust and courage would remain with him. John returned to his cabin, taking a deep breath as he stepped inside. The space felt quiet and empty without the presence of the boys and their family. Yet it also held a new sense of meaning. The past few days had transformed the cabin from a simple shelter into a place where trust had been tested, courage had been demonstrated, and humanity had been celebrated. John reflected on the events with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had faced uncertainty, danger, and the unknown, and through patience and empathy he had made a lasting difference in the lives of others. The forest around him seemed alive with new energy. Birds sang more brightly, the sunlight sparkled through the trees, and even the wind felt gentler. John knew that life in the wilderness would continue to be unpredictable, filled with both challenges and beauty. Yet he also knew that the lessons of the past days, lessons of trust, compassion, and courage, would stay with him forever. Spent asking us. Someday Dal Bal Beetov raised his audiences. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, understanding that small acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating moments of peace and connection even in the most difficult circumstances. As evening approached, John sat by the fire reflecting on the journey that had begun with two exhausted boys arriving at his doorstep. He thought about the fear, the uncertainty, and the tension of the days that had passed. He thought about the courage of the boys, the wisdom of their father, and the discipline of the warriors. Most of all, he thought about the choices he had made. The decision to offer shelter, to provide care, and to trust in the goodness of others. Those choices, simple as they seemed, had led to a moment of harmony that would be remembered by all involved. The boys' journey back to their tribe became a story that would be told in the forest for generations. John's name, spoken in gratitude and respect, would live in their hearts as a symbol of trust and kindness. The father, wise and perceptive, would remember the courage it took for a stranger to protect his sons, and the warriors would recall the rare moment when empathy overcame fear. John, in turn, would carry the memory of their trust, their laughter, and their resilience, a reminder that humanity could prevail even in the harshest of landscapes. As night fell, John sat by the fire one last time, letting the warmth and quiet of the cabin envelop him. He realized that this experience had changed him profoundly. Living alone in the wilderness had taught him self-reliance, but helping others had taught him something even more important: the power of compassion, courage, and trust. He knew that the world outside would continue to be unpredictable, that danger could appear at any moment, but he also knew that the choices he had made would leave a lasting impact on those who had crossed his path. The stars appeared above, shining brightly in the clear night sky, and John felt a deep sense of peace. He understood that the bond formed between himself and the boys, and between himself and their father, was a testament to the best qualities of humanity. In offering help, he had strengthened the threads of connection, and in doing so, had created a moment that would live long in memory. Though the forest remained wild and untamed, the lesson was clear. Courage, kindness, and trust could bridge even the widest divides, and one person's actions could change the course of lives. And so John settled by the fire, watching the flickering flames dance in the quiet night. He felt the satisfaction of a mission fulfilled, of lives protected, and of trust earned. Outside, the wilderness stretched endlessly, full of challenges and wonders. But inside, he knew that even in solitude, the bonds of humanity could shine brighter than fear. The story of two exhausted boys, a courageous stranger, and a wise father had come to a close, leaving behind a legacy of hope, empathy, and courage that would never be forgotten.